The email came late at night, its subject line cold and clinical. Special assignment notification. I had been with Orvis Tech for 6 years, working my way up from an overworked intern to a comfortable role in middle management. Special assignments weren't unheard of. They were coveted, signs of trust from higher-ups. But something about this one felt off. When I arrived at the designated facility, a bland industrial park an hour outside the city, the guards took my phone and asked me to sign a non-disclosure agreement thicker than any I'd ever seen. My gut twisted a quiet, gnawing anxiety, but I ignored it. It was, after all, just another job. Inside, the place was silent. The air smelled faintly of bleach, and the walls were painted an institutional gray. The meeting room where I was escorted was already half full. Familiar faces, colleagues I'd seen in passing over the years, but no one seemed interested in small talk. Everyone sat with their eyes on the table, their postures stiff. "Welcome to the team," a voice broke the silence. A man I didn't recognize, wearing an impeccably pressed suit, stood at the front. He introduced himself as Mr. Elias and began explaining the project, a critical component for a system so innovative that even its name was classified. He spoke in broad, vague terms, the kind that made my palms sweat. My questions about deliverables and deadlines were met with thin, practiced smiles and deflections. Lunch was served in the break room, and I finally had a chance to corner one of the others, a woman named Janet from accounting who I knew in passing. She avoided eye contact as she whispered, "Just do your work. Don't ask questions." That evening, after hours of meticulously completing meaningless assignments, I returned to the dormitory we were required to stay in. The tiny room had no windows, and the only decoration was a small company-issued desk calendar. My thoughts kept circling back to Janet's warning. Why couldn't I shake the feeling that something here was deeply wrong? The next day, a man I'd sat next to during the morning briefing wasn't at his workstation. When I asked Mr. Elias about it, he replied curtly, "Reassignment." But Janet's pale face told me a different story. "That's what they call it," she murmured later. "But no one ever comes back." That evening, I logged onto the shared company database to complete my daily task and noticed something strange. My employee ID, once linked to my home address, bank accounts, and emergency contacts, had been altered. The details now matched a location I'd never heard of in an account that wasn't mine. Panic bubbled in my chest. I double-checked, triple-checked, but the data was unmistakably changed. The following morning, I attempted to call the only person I trusted, my brother. But the line didn't even ring. When I confronted Janet again, she simply whispered, "You're not supposed to exist outside this project anymore." Her words hit me like a freight train. I wasn't just assigned here. I was being erased. Desperation fueled my escape plan. That night, under the guise of using the restroom, I slipped out of the dormitory and into the facility service corridors. My heart pounded in my ears as I moved silently through the dimly lit halls, my breath hitching at every distant sound. At last, I found an unlocked exit door and sprinted into the darkness, the cold air slicing against my skin. But when I reached my car, I froze. It wasn't mine. The plates were wrong, and the belongings inside, a sweater, an old coffee mug, weren't things I owned. My chest tightened as the realization set in. My identity, my life, had been overwritten. A sudden light snapped on behind me. Footsteps approached. "Mr. Clark," Mr. Elias's voice called, calm but firm. "You should come back inside." I ran. But even now, weeks later, I can't tell you where I am. No ID, no money, no proof I ever worked for Orvis Tech. My old home is occupied by a family who swears they've lived there for years. My bank says I closed my accounts. And my brother, my only tether to who I was, answers the phone but claims he doesn't know me. Sometimes I wonder if I ever existed at all. I almost didn't take the gig. An immersive corporate training job. It sounded like the kind of bland, keep your head down and cash the check work I hated. But when my agent showed me the pay, triple what I'd made on my last indie commercial, I couldn't refuse. The first day was strange but manageable. They gave me a script, painstakingly detailed down to pauses and intonations, and explained my role, an angry employee in a conflict resolution simulation. The executives participating sat across from me in a boardroom mock-up, flanked by emotionless supervisors who scribbled notes on clipboards. My job wasn't just to act. It was to make these people feel cornered, uncomfortable, guilty. I didn't love it, but money was money. By the end of the day, I was sweating. The lines felt rehearsed, yes, but the reactions I provoked were painfully real. I could see people squirm, stumble over their words, their polite smiles cracking under pressure. A man in a pinstripe suit even burst into tears. The whole scene left me feeling hollow, like I'd kicked over a sandcastle just to prove I could. That night, I noticed something unusual. My apartment felt wrong. A drawer was ajar that I hadn't opened. A book I always kept on the nightstand was on the floor. I wrote it off as exhaustion, maybe clumsiness on my part. But then, as I fell into bed, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Stick to the script. The second day, I broke the rules. Just once. During a scenario about whistleblowing, I decided to improvise. The line felt stilted, so I added a small flourish, something minor that I thought might better sell the moment. No one would notice, I figured. Someone noticed. During the lunch break, 2 supervisors approached me with grim expressions. Step into the hallway, one of them said. The air between us felt electric, charged with quiet hostility. In the hallway, they boxed me in. You don't deviate. Ever. Understood. One of them growled. His calm exterior cracked just enough to reveal something darker underneath. I nodded quickly, swallowing the lump in my throat. Good, he said. Let's hope we don't need to have this conversation again. When I got home, my apartment had been ransacked. Clothes were strewn across the floor, drawers emptied, my laptop smashed. I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to piece together how someone could have gotten in. The message on my mirror, scrawled in thick red lipstick, chilled me to my core. We told you. I called the company. No answer. I emailed my agent, who brushed it off as a coincidence. Maybe you got robbed, she said, her tone light but unconvincing. But I wasn't so sure. The next day, I went in like nothing was wrong. I kept my head down, delivered my lines perfectly, and didn't so much as flinch when the supervisor stared at me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every movement, every word, cataloged and dissected. I decided I needed answers. During a break, I snuck into an office where they stored the session recordings. My hands trembled as I sifted through the files. What I found made my blood run cold. The videos weren't just training exercises. They were manipulation sessions, designed to groom people into corporate saboteurs or whistleblowers. The so-called participants were being set up for roles they didn't even know they were auditioning for. Before I could process what I'd uncovered, the door opened. A supervisor stood there, his face expressionless but his eyes sharp. You shouldn't be in here, he said. I ran. My car was parked 2 blocks away, but it felt like miles as I sprinted down the street, every shadow feeling like it might reach out and grab me. I didn't go back to the company. I couldn't. My phone was filled with messages for weeks afterward. Warnings, veiled threats, even vague offers to discuss my future. The job paid well, sure, but no amount of money is worth what I lost. My peace of mind, my sense of safety. I still see those supervisors sometimes, just out of the corner of my eye, always disappearing before I can confirm it's them. They haven't forgotten me, and I know they never will. It's strange how the small comforts of life, a favorite cafe, a familiar routine, can feel like anchors in an otherwise chaotic world. For me and my coworkers, that cafe was La Sombra. Nestled on a narrow side street in the city center, it was unremarkable at first glance. A few mismatched chairs on the terrace, faint strains of flamenco on the speakers, and coffee that was more bitter than sweet. But it was ours. We would gather there every Wednesday after work, the clinking of espresso cups mingling with whispered gossip about office politics. The older regulars, men in their 60s and 70s, would lean back with newspapers folded neatly, talking softly about football or the news of the day. It felt timeless, like a place that could never truly disappear. Until one day, it did. I arrived at noon, the usual bustle of the lunch rush in full swing. Or so I thought. As I rounded the corner, the first thing I noticed was silence. The terrace was gone. The wrought iron chairs, the little folding tables, the chalkboard with its daily specials. All of it erased as if it had never existed. The building looked abandoned, its shutters drawn tight. A sign hung lopsided in the window, the kind you see when places are closed for repairs. But this sign was blank, its edges frayed from weathering. My stomach churned with unease as I reached for my phone to text my coworker, Anna. Did La Sombra close? Thought we were meeting here. Her reply came quickly. La Sombra? Where's that? Never heard of it. We're meeting in El Sol Café on Calle Mayor, remember? I reread her message twice, my pulse quickening. How could she not remember? We'd been coming to La Sombra for months. It was our spot. The place where she'd confessed her crush on Enrique from marketing, where we'd toasted to Lucia's retirement, where we'd laughed until tears streamed down our faces. But now, it was as if the place had been wiped from existence. And not just physically, no one I asked seemed to recall it ever being there. That night, I scoured the internet. Nothing. No reviews, no photos, not even a trace of its business license. My stomach sank. Could I have imagined it? Had I been so consumed with work and routine that I fabricated an entire cafe? But no. I remembered the barista's mole, the old man with the gray beret who always sat by the window, the smell of burnt sugar wafting from the kitchen. I couldn't have invented all of it. The next day, my unease turned to dread. My phone buzzed with a notification, a message from an anonymous number. It was a link. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. It led to a video, grainy footage of me and my coworkers, laughing over cortados and pastries. At first, I felt relief, a confirmation that La Sombra had been real. But the relief evaporated when I noticed the angle. The video was taken from above, as if through a hidden camera. And then I noticed the timestamps. They weren't random. The recordings captured specific moments when we talked about sensitive office topics, our clients' confidential dealings, our frustrations with management, moments we thought were private. Another message followed. You've said enough. Move on. I didn't know what to do. I showed the video to Anna, desperate for someone to corroborate my story. But she just frowned and said, I don't remember this. You're not well. That night, I dreamt of La Sombra. I could see it vividly, the clatter of plates, the hum of conversation. And behind the counter, the barista stared at me, his eyes dark and unblinking. He whispered something I couldn't make out, but I woke up drenched in sweat, my ears ringing. 2 weeks later, I was walking through the city when I saw him, the barista standing on a busy corner. I ran toward him, shouting, but as I got closer, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. In his place was a slip of paper on the ground. It read, "The more you dig, the more you lose." I stopped asking questions after that. But even now, years later, I feel a weight pressing on my chest whenever I pass that street. It's just another blank building now, another forgotten space. But I know better. La Sombra was real, and someone, somewhere wanted it forgotten. It was my first real job, the one every law graduate dreams of. The office smelled of freshly printed briefs and leather-bound books. Prestige radiated from every corner, and my colleagues moved with the brisk confidence of people who knew they belonged. For a small-town girl like me, it was surreal. My first case wasn't glamorous, an inheritance dispute between two estranged brothers. I was handed the client file with little ceremony and told to review it. But even in my excitement, I noticed something odd. Some documents were pristine, while others had typos and odd inconsistencies, like they'd been rushed or altered. I chalked it up to human error. After all, this was a law firm, not a crime thriller. Still, as the days passed, those inconsistencies began to pile up. Alibis contradicted timelines. Witnesses' statements shifted subtly between drafts. The little voice of doubt in my head grew louder. One evening, just as the office was winding down, I brought it up to my mentor, Javier. He was the kind of lawyer people whispered about, a man who could charm a judge with a single smile. He listened to my concerns with a patient expression, his pen tapping lightly on his desk. "Good catch," he said, finally smiling. "But remember, we don't question what's handed down from above. Our job is to win." I nodded, but his words didn't sit right. Why wouldn't we question? Isn't the law supposed to be about uncovering the truth? A week later, I found out just how wrong I was. It started with a simple instruction. File these with the court by Friday, Javier said, dropping a folder on my desk. I flipped it open and froze. The evidence was fabricated. Obviously so. It wasn't even subtle. Altered timestamps, photos that looked doctored. My stomach churned. When I hesitated, he leaned over, lowering his voice. Don't overthink it. It's a formality. Just do it. That night, I couldn't sleep. What would happen if I refused? Would they fire me? Smear my reputation? I imagined Javier's face, calm and knowing, as if he already had an answer ready for every excuse I could muster. The next morning, I did what I told myself I wouldn't. I submitted the documents. My palms were clammy as I handed them to the court clerk. It felt like betrayal, not just of my principles, but of myself. 2 days later, I was called into Javier's office. His tone was warm, almost fatherly. Well done on the inheritance case, he said. You're fitting in nicely. But as I turned to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, oh, and we need your signature on this non-disclosure agreement. Routine stuff. The document was dense with legal jargon, but one clause stood out. I couldn't discuss any cases I worked on, even with colleagues. My throat tightened. They weren't just covering their tracks, they were covering mine. Weeks passed. I buried myself in work, trying to forget what I'd done. But then came the summons. A court official arrived at my desk with a folded envelope. Inside were charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. My signature was on the documents they'd cited. I ran to Javier, my panic barely contained. He listened quietly, then leaned back in his chair with an unsettling calm. Don't worry, he said. This isn't unusual. We'll handle it. But as I looked at him, I saw it, the indifference to the calculation. I wasn't a valued employee. I was a pawn, chosen because I was expendable. I tried to leave that day, packed my things, handed in my resignation. But as I reached the elevator, 2 security guards stopped me. We need to check your bag, one of them said. What for? I asked, my voice trembling. Policy was all they offered. Inside my bag, they found a USB drive. I hadn't packed it. I didn't even recognize it. But when they opened it, it contained files from the firm, files I'd never seen, files that implicated me in more fabricated evidence. I was escorted back upstairs, where Javier waited, his hands folded neatly on his desk. Leaving isn't an option, he said softly. But if you stay, we'll take care of everything. That night, I went home to an apartment that didn't feel like mine anymore. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like a stranger's, someone who had stepped off a ledge, hoping the fall wouldn't kill her. Now, years later, I still wonder if I made the right choice. I stayed, of course. What else could I do? But every time I see my name on a case, I think about the lies it's tied to. And every night, I lock my door twice, wondering if the real prison isn't the one I walk into every morning, but the one I carry inside me. When I was a child, my father would always take me to the public library on Saturdays. Those memories were soft, golden, hours spent among shelves that seemed to breathe history. As I grew older, the library became a refuge. In a world that felt too fast, it was a place where time seemed to stand still. It was a habit I'd never broken, even as a journalist chasing deadlines. One rainy afternoon, I ducked into the library near my apartment in Madrid, seeking both shelter and solace. The place had changed little over the years. The same worn wooden desks, the same librarian with her horn-rimmed glasses and a gaze that seemed to pierce through to your intentions. I had been investigating a story, a corporate corruption scandal that had already made some powerful people uncomfortable. My editor had cautioned me, be careful where you dig. These aren't the kind of people who forgive curiosity. But I couldn't let it go. The threads were too tangled, too tantalizing. That day, as I worked through another stack of documents, my laptop pinged. A new network had appeared, Archivado. The name struck me as odd. The library's Wi-Fi was usually called Biblioteca Publica. Curious, I connected. My browser refreshed, and a directory of files appeared. At first glance, it was mundane. Inventory lists, old meeting notes. But as I scrolled further, I found an encrypted database. The folder was labeled Confidential Privado. I shouldn't have opened it. I know that now. But the pull of curiosity, of that journalist's hunger, was too strong. After all, I was chasing a story about secrecy, and here it was laid bare. I cracked the encryption with a simple program a tech-savvy friend had given me years ago. It felt almost too easy. The files were stunning. Names of politicians, dates, wire transfers to offshore accounts. A web of illegal deals connected multinational corporations to some of the most powerful people in Spain. My chest tightened as I read. This was the story of a lifetime, if I lived to tell it. That's when the library's lights flickered. At first, I thought it was the storm outside, but then the Wi-Fi connection dropped. A moment later, the librarian appeared by my desk. She leaned in close, her voice a whisper. "You need to leave," she said, her words clipped and urgent. "Now!" Her eyes darted toward the windows, and I followed her gaze. A black car idled across the street, its windows tinted, the engine humming faintly against the rain. I gathered my things and slipped out the side entrance, my pulse racing. The streets felt too quiet, the storm too loud. I could feel eyes on me, even though the sidewalks were empty. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. The first message arrived that night. "Delete what you found," it read. "No signature, no sender." Just those 4 words. The second message came the next morning, attached to an email, a photograph of me leaving the library, my laptop under my arm. Beneath it was a single line. "Some things are not yours to know." For days, I tried to continue my work, but my personal information started to leak online. My address, my phone number, even emails I'd written years ago. Friends called, worried. My editor suggested I take a step back. But the story had burrowed into me, deeper than any fear. The third warning came in person. It was early evening when the buzzer rang. Through the intercom, a man's voice greeted me, smooth and professional. "Señorita, I have a package for you." "I didn't order anything," I replied. There was silence for a moment. Then the voice softened. "We only want to talk." I didn't open the door. Instead, I called the police, but when they arrived, the man and the black car parked outside were gone. That night, I packed a bag. It was clear I couldn't stay. I wish I could tell you I published the story, that my byline ran across every front page in the country. But I couldn't. Every attempt to share the files was met with immediate blocks, emails bouncing back, and calls that ended before they began. Someone was watching, always a step ahead. Now, I live in a small coastal town where no one knows my name. The files are hidden, copies stashed in places I pray no one finds. But sometimes, when I'm walking along the shore or sitting in a quiet cafe, I feel a presence. A shadow that lingers too long. A car that passes one too many times. I keep telling myself it's paranoia. But deep down, I know they haven't forgotten. And they're waiting for me to make the next move. The first time I met Ricardo, I didn't trust him. Parole officers are trained to spot liars, and everything about him screamed professional con man. But his case file was peculiar. An embezzlement scandal involving millions siphoned off from a multinational corporation. His sentence had been harsh, disproportionate even. Something about it didn't sit right. Ricardo was polite, well-dressed despite his circumstances, with a careful way of speaking. Too careful, I thought. He had a tendency to pause before answering, as if weighing every word. "I didn't do it," he told me during our first meeting, his hands clasped tightly. "They framed me." I had heard it all before. Every convict thinks they're innocent. But there was something in his eyes, a desperation that didn't seem rehearsed. He handed me a stack of papers, a tangle of court records, emails, and financial statements he'd smuggled out of prison. "Please," he said, "just look." I should have refused. Parole officers aren't supposed to dig into old cases. But curiosity won out. That night, after my shift, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. As I sifted through them, the pieces didn't add up. The evidence against Ricardo was flimsy at best, doctored emails, witnesses who contradicted themselves. Yet no one had questioned it. Why? The next morning, Ricardo was waiting in my office, a faint smile on his face. "You looked, didn't you?" he asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I told him to keep his head down, stick to his conditions, and avoid trouble. But as the weeks passed, I couldn't shake the unease. Something about his case gnawed at me, like a splinter buried too deep to remove. It wasn't until his next check-in that he dropped a bombshell. "They're still watching me," he said, his voice low. "The company. They're keeping tabs on both of us now." I laughed nervously. "What are you talking about?" He leaned forward, his eyes darting toward the window. "They didn't just frame me. They used me as a scapegoat. And now that you've started digging, you're a loose end." His paranoia was infectious. That night, I noticed a black car parked across from my apartment. Its headlights flickered once as I drew the curtains. I told myself it was a coincidence. Madrid is full of cars. What were the chances it had anything to do with me? But the next day, my laptop refused to turn on. The screen flickered briefly before going dark. A single line of text flashing, "Stop now." I confronted Ricardo during our next meeting. "What the hell have you dragged me into?" I demanded. "They'll do anything to protect themselves," he said. "If you want to survive this, we need to work together." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We pored over his records, piecing together a timeline of how his company had funneled money into secret accounts, then pinned the blame on him when investigators got too close. Every lead brought us closer to the truth and closer to danger. One evening, as I was leaving work, I found my car tires slashed. A note was tucked under the wiper blade. "Last warning." The next day, Ricardo's apartment was ransacked. His parole ankle monitor showed he hadn't left his building all night, but when I called to check on him, his voice shook. "They're sending a message," he whispered. The breaking point came when I returned home to find my front door ajar. Inside, everything was in its place, except for a photo of my parents, which had been moved to the center of the coffee table. The unspoken threat was clear. I packed a bag that night. Ricardo and I decided to meet at a small pension in the outskirts of Madrid, far from prying eyes. We had one goal: to take what we'd found to a journalist who could expose the company. But as I approached the pension, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ricardo's number. "They got me. Don't come." I stopped dead in my tracks, the dim streetlights casting long shadows on the empty road. I tried calling him, but the line went straight to voicemail. Panicking, I called a taxi and returned to the city, my heart pounding the entire way. The next day, Ricardo's parole records were wiped clean from the system. His name, his file, his very existence. It was as if he had never been under my supervision. When I pressed my superiors for answers, they told me I'd been reassigned and warned against asking further questions. I still see that black car sometimes, parked on the corner of my street. It never stays long, but it doesn't have to. It's a reminder, a quiet, insistent whisper that some truths are too dangerous to uncover, and that the only escape is silence. The auction house had always felt like a temple to me. The silence inside was reverent, broken only by the soft shuffle of feet on marble floors or the hushed murmurs of art enthusiasts admiring pieces that carried the weight of centuries. When I landed the job there, cataloging items for their upcoming seasonal sale, it felt like stepping into a dream. That day, I had been assigned to inspect a collection from a private estate, a mix of paintings, sculptures, and decorative artifacts. My job was to authenticate, appraise, and ensure their provenance. It was meticulous work, perfect for someone like me who loved the stories objects carried. Then I found the painting. It was unassuming at first, a small oil-on canvas of a pastoral scene, its brushstrokes delicate, its colors faded with time. But as I examined it under a magnifying glass, I noticed faint markings beneath the surface. They weren't accidental. They were deliberate, almost like a watermark. Curiosity sparked. I consulted the auction house's records. The painting wasn't flagged as unusual. Its description was brief, its provenance vague. But something about those markings felt important. I spent the evening combing through archives, old ledgers, and digital databases. Finally, I found a clue, a reference to a similar mark on artwork stolen during World War II. My pulse quickened. If this was one of those stolen pieces, it didn't belong in a private collection or on an auction block. It belonged in a museum, or better yet, back with its rightful owners. The next morning, I went to my supervisor, a tall, polished woman named Elena. I laid out my findings, expecting her to share my concern. Instead, she sighed, tapping her manicured nails against the desk. It's a delicate matter, she said. The client insists on anonymity. We can't pursue this without jeopardizing our reputation. But if it's stolen, she cut me off. Your job is to prepare the catalog. Leave the rest to the legal team. Her tone left no room for argument, but her eyes betrayed something else. Fear, perhaps? Or guilt? I couldn't tell. I returned to my desk, my mind racing. That evening, I decided to reach out to a historian I knew, someone who had dedicated their career to tracking stolen wartime art. I sent him photos of the painting, careful to omit any identifying details. His response came within hours. "This is big," he wrote. "The marking belongs to a piece listed as missing for decades. If you have it, you need to report it." The next day, I noticed subtle changes in the office. Elena avoided me, her usual polished confidence replaced with clipped words and darting glances. My colleagues seemed quieter, the kind of quiet that comes when people know something you don't. That evening, I stayed late to gather more evidence. As I sifted through records, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I jumped, my heart pounding. It was Javier, one of the senior appraisers. "You're making waves," he said softly, almost kindly. "It's not worth it." "Javier, this painting." "I know," he interrupted, "and I know what happens to people who dig too deep." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I wanted to ask more, but his expression silenced me. He left without another word, leaving me alone in the vast, echoing halls of the auction house. The next morning, Elena was gone. Her office was cleared, her nameplate removed. The official story was that she'd resigned for personal reasons. But the timing felt too convenient. Then came the threats. First, it was a call to my personal phone. A man's voice, calm and measured. "Drop it. For your own good." Next, an envelope slipped under my apartment door. Inside was a photo of me, taken as I left the auction house late one night. Beneath it, a handwritten note. "Your career isn't worth the risk." I wanted to believe they were bluffing. But when I found my tires slashed and a brick through my living room window, I knew they weren't. I reported the threats to the police, but they seemed uninterested. "Without proof of who's behind this, there's not much we can do," the officer said, his tone indifferent. In the end, I backed down. The painting was sold, its markings scrubbed from the records. My historian friends stopped responding to emails, and I learned to stop asking questions. But every time I walk into the auction house, I feel it, the weight of what I know and the fear that someone might still be watching. It was my neighbor, Arturo, who first told me about the gym. "It's unlike anything else," he said over coffee in the plaza. "State-of-the-art equipment, private sessions, even a spa. You'll feel like royalty." Arturo was a man of refinement, always impeccably dressed, his opinions carrying weight in our little corner of Madrid. So when he handed me the sleek black membership card embossed with gold letters, I took it as a kind of endorsement. The gym was tucked away in a quiet alley near Gran Via, its entrance unmarked save for a discreet brass plaque. Inside, it was like stepping into another world. Everything gleamed. The chrome machines, the polished wood floors, even the glass walls that offered views of the serene rooftop pool. A receptionist with a voice as smooth as velvet welcomed me, taking my health data and biometric scan before handing me a locker key. "Standard procedure," she said with a smile, "for a personalized experience." It felt excessive, but I shrugged it off. This wasn't your average gym. The members, too, seemed different, polished, successful, their silence unsettling. They avoided eye contact, their whispered conversations ceasing the moment I passed. At first, I loved it. The machines tracked my progress with unnerving precision, adjusting resistance without my input. The locker room was spotless, the showers luxurious. But it wasn't long before I noticed strange patterns. My assigned locker was always stocked with towels embroidered with my initials, though I hadn't requested them. Every time I entered, the playlist was inexplicably tailored to my favorite songs. I should have felt pampered, but instead, it was suffocating. I felt like the gym knew me too well. Things took a darker turn when I overheard a conversation in the sauna. Two men, speaking in low tones, mentioned something about the selection process. Their voices were clipped, deliberate, like they were discussing a business deal. "What's the selection process?" I asked, trying to sound casual. They exchanged a glance before one of them stood abruptly. "You're new here," he said. "Don't worry about it." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I searched online for information about the gym, but its digital footprint was almost non-existent. Just a single page with vague phrases like tailored fitness, elite community. The next morning, I decided to cancel my membership. The receptionist didn't seem surprised. She simply nodded, her smile unwavering. "Of course, but you signed a contract," she said, pulling up a document on her tablet. The contract was pages long, filled with dense legal jargon. Near the end, one clause stood out. Leaving required a mandatory exit process involving the forfeiture of all biometric data collected during my time there. "I didn't agree to this," I said, my voice rising. "You did," she replied, gesturing to my digital signature at the bottom. I left without making a scene, my pulse racing. That night, I found an email in my inbox from the gym. The subject line was chillingly simple: "We hope you'll reconsider." Attached were graphs detailing my workouts, my heart rate patterns, even my dietary habits, all data I hadn't provided but was somehow now in their possession. The following day, I returned to confront them. The receptionist was gone, replaced by a man in a crisp black suit. "You're not obligated to stay," he said, his voice calm. "But you should consider the consequences." "What consequences?" I demanded. He handed me a file. Inside were photos, me at my favorite cafe, walking to work, even sitting in my living room. The implication was clear. I didn't sleep that night. My thoughts spiraled, imagining who these people were and what they wanted. It wasn't just a gym, it was a surveillance network collecting data on its members for purposes I couldn't fathom. The next morning, I tried contacting Arturo, but his phone was disconnected. When I visited his apartment, a stranger answered the door, claiming no one by that name had ever lived there. I burned the membership card, though I knew it was a futile gesture. I stopped going to my usual spots, avoided routines, and even changed my phone number. But sometimes, when I'm out, I catch glimpses, familiar faces from the gym, watching from across the street, or lingering just long enough to be noticed. I stopped trying to fight it. The gym isn't a place you quit. It's a place that decides when it's done with you. Don't forget to subscribe. You are the best.